and if you need a ride, we leave at 7. Also, if you are not a member yet and would like to be, we're an RSO at UNL, and if you want to be a member, let one of us know, either me or Zach or Will, and we can get you hooked up with that. Also sign up for our emails if you don't already to get news of what we do weekly. Also, next semester in March, we have a trip to Utah. It's an applied apologetics intensive, oh goodness, what does that say? Okay, so if you're interested in that, talk to Wesley, and yeah, we're excited to do that. That's all I have for now. I'd like to leave it up to Wesley for the rest of the tonight.
Hooray! Yay. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Matt. And I didn't hit my mic on, so nobody heard my awesome joke. It was hilarious. Okay, so we're trying to stream to Facebook, but we're figuring it out. Will's back there working at it. Good job, Will. I do want to reiterate the Applied Apologetics intensive trip to Utah. We are going to Utah for a 1 week to learn how to share your faith confidently. And I know you all had the time, the week in your schedules as the 14th through the 21st, but you have to change it now. So I'm sorry that you have to change it in your schedules. But that's okay. I'm giving you plenty of warning. We're changing it to the 6th to the 13th. We had it at that next week because that's when spring break was, but I don't think there's going to be a spring break next month. Not next month either. I'll get it right. Next semester. Nailed it. Okay, so I don't think there's going to be spring break next semester. So anyway, you can come. You'll have to tell your professor, hey, I'm going to go on a trip. What can I do early? And then you'll come and learn. What we do is evangelize to the Latter-day Saint community and anybody else there. And that gives you confidence because you are talking to somebody who has skewed doctrine, and then you have to get into the Bible and say, wait a second, that doesn't say that. And then you learn, and you get kind of confused, and then you get frustrated, and then you learn, and then you get a big heart for the lost because there's people there that God loves that need to know the truth of the gospel. So it's an awesome trip, and I, myself and Ben, will be leading it, and we'll drive down there together. It'll be awesome. So come to it, please. He's not coming. He told me earlier. That's okay. I'll get him. So tonight, we are talking about racism and slavery, and the order of the night is we're going to talk about why racism is wrong. I'm going to make that statement. I'm going to make that argument, and then I'm going to talk about why slavery is wrong, and then I'm going to go into the objection that I often hear, which is the Bible is immoral because it endorses slavery. So we are getting into slavery, racism, kind of putting people on different levels and figuring out why that is wrong in our ethics series in our what is morally right semester. So first, I have a few times that we'll talk to each other. So you'll just have to turn your chairs or make little groups here. The first question that I'm going to address, you're going to address, is why is racism wrong? So I do want you to dialogue with your neighbors about this and figure out, see if you can figure out the reason why racism is not something that is to be desired. So talk to your neighbors for about 3 entire minutes, and I'll come back and we'll keep going. Ready? Go. 3 minutes. Nailed it. Good stuff. Okay. Thanks, guys, for having those questions and doing them. Now, I do want to ask you to give me answers so I can play off of your answers as a teacher does. What did you come up with? What was like the reason why you came up with why racism is wrong? What is a 1 or 4-word answer that you can give? I'll call on you. It's okay if you raise your hand. You have permission. You don't have to raise your hand. Tell me. Why is racism wrong? I don't like it. That could be a reason.
We're all created in the image of God.
Image of God. Okay. Thanks, Will. That's a neat answer.
We're all descended from one couple.
Descended from one couple. I like that. Adam and Eve. That's a neat answer.
Well, racism kind of implies that your race determines your value.
Race determines value. If
And
your or racism implies that race determines your value.
right, yeah.
Okay.
And so I don't think that a superficial or like a thing that you like trait about yourself that you can't change
A trait that you can't control shouldn't be a determiner of
your value.
your value. Neat answers, guys. I thank you very much. That's really cool. You guys didn't talk about anything. That's cool. Racism. Just kidding. We're moving on. Racism, by definition, here's an answer for you. This is what I looked up on the Google. Racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism that's directed against a person or a people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that's a minority or marginalized. Doesn't have to be a minority or marginalized group or person, but it's typical. Racism in this definition lays out 3 different things: prejudice, discrimination, and antagonism. And I want to pull those apart a little bit, so and see what those 3 things kind of mean and what those 3 things imply. Because all 3 of those, if used on the basis of race, on the basis of someone's particular membership in a race or ethnicity, is a racist. That is what the definition means. So I want to pull each one apart and examine it. So antagonistic. Can you be antagonistic without being racist? I would argue yes, and that in certain circumstances you can be antagonistic in an appropriate way. That can be an appropriate thing to do in terms of it's not always a bad thing. So like if you're having a conversation with your friend and you're just being antagonistic toward them, you're not being racist if you're not basing it on race. If you're just being an antagonist, then you're just kind of being a jerk. The way that I would argue it would be maybe appropriate, or could be argued that it could be appropriate, is if someone is being antagonistic and if you kind of just match their level of being antagonistic, it's probably not the best move, but it could be appropriate in a certain situation, right? So, being antagonistic, if you pull apart from race, is not necessarily a bad thing. Discrimination is Can you be discriminatory? Can you discriminate without being racist? I would also argue that yes, and that often discriminating is not a bad thing in and of itself. It can actually be a good thing, like if I gave you a compliment and said, hey, you have discriminating taste on food, then that would be, you can discern different flavors based on what you're eating, right? And you have good discriminating taste. Ben, a couple weeks ago, talked about the ethics of war and the ethics of killing in those circumstances when you need to discriminate based on combatants and the innocent, right? That would be a thing that you need to discriminate on. You can't be non-discriminatory on that level, right? So antagonism, discrimination don't have to be a bad thing, and often they are either appropriate or good. What about prejudice, though? Can you be prejudiced without being racist? I would say yes, because prejudice just means prejudging, right? But if you take away race, then you're not being prejudiced based on race, which is racism. You're just being prejudiced based on something else. But is prejudice a good thing? Can prejudice ever be something that is acceptable or appropriate? I would argue no. I would argue that prejudice is the root of racism, because to be racist, you are being prejudiced. What's prejudice? Prejudice is preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. So prejudice is having an opinion about something that isn't put through the filter of reason or actual experience with someone. And if you're prejudiced, if you have this preconceived opinion based on race, then that's, so not based on reason or actual experience. Based on race, though, that would be called racist. So racism is wrong because it prejudges someone or a group of people, not based on reason or actual experience, but rather based solely on their race or ethnicity. So what is, now we're getting down further in, what is reason or actual experience? Well, reason, I would tell you to think about a judge and jury. When you're a judge or jury, you don't have actual experience with the accused, but you are told to make a judgment. You are told to reason through the two different arguments that you're being given, but from the defense and the other one, defense. Offense, defense. That's not it. Prosecutor and the defense attorney. They're painting two different pictures, and you as the judge and jury are supposed to take both of these pictures and judge this person based on reason. You don't have any experience with them, but you're supposed to judge based on reason and logic. So reason is thinking and understanding and forming judgments based on logic. And it's understood that the logic has to be good. You can't have poor logic and say, I have reasons. Well, you can't. You have to, it has to be good logic, right? Actual experience. What is actual experience? Well, that is just practical contact with observations of facts or evidence. So you're actual having physical experience. You guys don't really need to have actual experience be defined to you. But when you have prejudice, you don't have either one of these things. If you have one of them, then you're no longer being prejudiced. You're judging based on one of those two things. So the way to not be racist is to not prejudge. And I would call that the way that you fix being racist, is if you put aside prejudice, you are no longer being racist because you'd have actual experience or reason. Now, you can kind of conceive of a time if somebody has actual experience with somebody, but then still is prejudiced toward them. I still don't think that's possible, because you have those arguments in your head, you have those judgments in your head about your opinions of this person, rather than judging them based on their race. You're judging them based on those experiences. And if you judge them based on race, then you're being prejudiced again. So I think removing prejudice would be the answer. So if you remove prejudice, you're no longer prejudging, you're no longer prejudiced, you're just regular judging, which is what we are all called to do and what we all do anyway. Martin Luther King Jr., in his famous speech, even said that he doesn't want his children to be judged based on the color of their skin, but rather being judged by the content of their character. And this is the thing that that's always ringing in my head about racism, is why would you be racist when the person hasn't shown you the content of their character, or you don't have reason, right? You're not a part of a jury or something. So you have to have actual experience with the person in order to judge the content of their character. Then after you've had that experience, you're free to act and speak your mind about the content of their character rather than based on race. So I have another question for you guys, for you to ask your groups and maybe expand them a little bit if you can. We've talked a lot about someone having prejudice and acting as such, getting rid of it, working with those things. What if, can you be unconsciously racist? Like, is that a possible thing that you can do in your life? Is it something that's something that you can do? Can you be unconsciously racist? Something you're unaware of? 3 entire minutes. Go. Come on back. All right. Good stuff. What a fun topic of conversation. Yes. So, To put a bow on this question, my thoughts would be, can one be unconsciously racist? I would say in the definition that we have and the ways that that people interact and the kind of the way that people can be grown up, yeah, I could say yes, that you can be. It's kind of one of those things. I gave a talk last semester, 2 semesters ago? Yeah, 2 semesters ago, called "Are You Reasonable?" And it was basically asking you to check your bias, check yourself. Are you actually as reasonable as you claim you are, or are you just predisposed to think this way, regardless of the evidence, or in spite of the evidence, even? So it sort of keys on that, in that. If you've been raised some way and you've been raised to hate a certain group of people or say certain things that could be offensive, and you just kind of unconsciously do that, because I don't think we're called to make sure that you don't offend all the time, every time. That would be really hard to do. But it is important for people to bring that up and talk to you and say, hey, could you see how that could be offensive to somebody? Or, hey, do you think that that's actually true? Which is kind of part of our job here at Ratio Christi, is to help you think well and think reasonably about the world. So yes, you can. I think we can say yes, you can be unconsciously racist, but it is up to other people to let you know about that, because if you don't know what you don't know, and so if you're running around saying a bunch of racist stuff, and somebody should probably confront you on that lovingly, and you should also lovingly say thank you and actually think about it. And if they're wrong, then they're wrong. And if you're wrong, then you're wrong. Go ahead and be wrong and fix yourself. So we've talked about racism. We talked about those things. I want to jump into if Christianity is true, racism is wrong. And it's a lot of my reasons here come from a lot of what you guys said, actually. So I'm just going to dive into the Bible and talk about why racism would be an incorrect thing to do as a Christian if Christianity is true. If Christianity is true, we are made in the image of God. First Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Meaning God made mankind and gave them, made them in his image, which endowed them with certain level of dignity. Acts 17:26 said that he made us from one man, and that was said out here. From one man, every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth. From one man made every nation of mankind, putting us on the same level as every nation of mankind. So to be racist, to look down on somebody because of their race would be inappropriate if we are made in his image and God made from one man every nation of mankind. There is no putting somebody underneath you or you above anybody else on the basis of race. And this one's probably my favorite, Revelation 7:9. This looks forward into the end times, and the writer John is looking forward and seeing a great multitude that no one can number from every nation, from all tribes, all peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So this is a picture of a vast multitude of people from every nation, tribe, people, and language, all on the same level, all before the throne, before the Lamb. So there's no discriminating based on nation, tribe, people, or language. That would be an inappropriate thing to do if Christianity is true. So that is my case for racism. Now I have a question for you again and your groups. Why is slavery wrong? 3 minutes, go. All right. Good stuff. So, thanks guys for talking through those questions and considering it yourself. And that's a lot of what I wanted to do. That's a lot of what we've been doing this semester is helping think through these questions. And I just thought it would be fun to throw that on you before you got a lot of things, because sometimes people have a lot of opinions about these things, and we kind of worked ourselves into a position, and it's fun to hear some of the things going on with your questions. So slavery, let's get into a definition. Slavery, when you type it into the Google, it says the practice or system of owning slaves. And I go, well, that's not helpful. So I type in slave. Well, a slave is a person who is the legal property of another and is forced to obey them. That's probably a secondary thing. If you're the legal property, you can do what they want because you're the property. So, is that something that's good? Now, I heard some of the words you guys were saying out there a little bit. I was paying slight attention. I was back there looking at the text, seeing how that was going. But is that something to be desired? Well, I would say in general, probably not. Also, no, you'd think. So I wanted to get into what slavery actually was and why and how it actually happened. Because if we just looked at racism, and if we're on the same level as people, if people are on the same level, or if being racist is not okay, owning a slave would probably be in that same category of not okay, because you're looking at them lower. And so I looked into it, and I would argue that antebellum slavery would be at its root not viewing or treating somebody with dignity, because if they are, especially antebellum slavery. Antebellum is, I think Ben said this word a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, I don't know what that means, but I'm too ashamed to ask anyone, so I'll look it up. So I looked it up, so I'll tell you if you don't know what it means. Ante is before, and bellum is the war, I think. So this is before the Civil War slavery. So basically slavery in America before the Civil War happened. So antebellum slavery is what we all kind of think about right when that comes to mind, right? I, as a Christian, there's things in the Bible that talk about slavery, and so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But when we think about slavery, we often think of antebellum slavery because it was not too long ago that was a reality here in America. We fought a war over it, and there was some fights, and there was some seceding that went on. So when we think of slavery, we think of that slavery. So that's the one I'm going to talk about for now. So antebellum slavery would be not treating or viewing someone with dignity. So when you don't view them, a fellow human who's on your same level, with dignity, you look down on them, and you start treating them that way. So I started thinking, what do we look down on? Or what's not on our same level? What doesn't have the same level as humans? Well, I'm talking about, what about, we have different creatures in the world. What about bugs? There was a fly in my office today, and I killed it. I didn't think anything of it. It was annoying me, so I killed it. Is that okay? Well, yeah. I mean, it's a bug, right? So how do you treat or view bugs? Well, they're not on the same level as humans, for sure. We're allowed to kill them when they annoy us. We can't do that with humans. We can't kill humans when they annoy us. That's illegal. In fact, in the Rwandan genocide, this is my other graphic I have. Creepy. But it's a guy stepping on some cockroaches. In the Rwandan genocide, the Hutu and the Tutsi, one of them referred to the other as cockroaches. And this is how they viewed them, and this is how they justified their actions. Is what do you do with cockroaches? You kill them, especially if they've invaded your house and they're not going to leave peaceably. If they can't listen to reason, then exterminate them. I pay a gentleman a $70-some every other month to come bug my house so that the bugs die when they come in, because I don't like bugs. So I'm appealing to your intuition here. Bugs are on the same, bugs, insects, these types of things are not on the same level as humans. And if they are, then there's some other issues that we need to work through. What about the dignity of animals? Let's move up a bit. I mean, bigger things, right? So how do we view or treat animals? Well, I would argue that animals also are not on the same level as humans. We use them for our enjoyment. I have a cat that I play with sometimes. He's awesome. We use them for work, also sustenance. Work and sustenance, those cows are going to work, and then once they're done working, they can probably kill them and eat them. This is something that we cannot do with humans. We can't use them in this way. We can't use them for our enjoyment. We can't use them for work in that way without paying them. And if animals had the same dignity as humans, then there's lots of other things you'd have to work through. I mean, you'd have to give them, like, I don't know, voting rights or something. Don't get me wrong, there's rules against, wrong ways of treating animals. Like, you can't go out and kill a bunch of stray dogs. That's bad. You get a criminal sentence for that. I mean, that's just not okay to do. But they're not on the same level as humans, right? There's an intuitive view of that, and the people that do espouse that they should be the same level as humans need to answer some questions, like where actually is the line in there? I mean, do you have just rats running all around your house and just let them run amok? How dare you not let them in your house and let them eat your food? What do you? So there would be another a creature that is not on the same level as humans. They have dignity, but it is not that as humans. And when you start viewing other humans with the same level as animals, there are things that go wrong. I have that image in my head. I can't remember the name of the movie. It was recent with Leo DiCaprio, and he lets a bunch of dogs just kill his slave after he tried to run away. Thank you. Boy, that was hard to see. There were a lot of things in that movie I didn't want to hear or see, but I mean, that's when you view a human as the level of your property and that type of thing, you can do those things to them, or those things can happen to them, and that we would bristle at. Why? Well, because humans don't have the same dignity as animals. Humans have a higher level of dignity on the same level as humans. I want to bring up Martin Luther King Jr. again, and he said in that same speech that he hopes that people will rise up and live out the true meaning of this creed, that all men, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now that was written in 1776, and actually Jefferson believed that the phrase, all men are created equal, to be self-evident and would ultimately resolve slavery. There was an abolitionist in that same year, Thomas Day, who wrote, if there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot, signing resolutions of independency with one hand and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves. So the abolitionist, Thomas Day, saw the contradiction between what was being said and what was being practiced. And he called that out, and lots of other abolitionists called that out, and eventually the Civil War happened. So it was written in here and also understood to mean all men, all humanity is created equal, and that's what that they were founded on. So there was some tension there. So at its root, slavery, antebellum slavery is wrong because it doesn't treat or view someone with dignity. It is dehumanizing. And that is the key phrase that I want to talk about, dehumanizing. So when you dehumanize someone, you pull them down from the dignity of a human, right? When you dehumanize someone, you don't treat them with their due and innate dignity. So, Wesley, how do I not sympathize with slavery? How do I not own slaves? Well, treat somebody with their due and innate dignity. There you go. So, now dig into that question. Why do humans have due and innate dignity? What about humans? So we've talked about dignity of other creatures, and slavery dehumanizes somebody. So if we're on the same level, why would humans, why would other people, why would fellow people have due and innate dignity? Is it just because they're fellow humans? And that's well, I would say yeah, it's because they're fellow humans. So then who are my fellow humans? What makes a human? What makes a person, if there's a distinction between those two things? I would argue no, there's not. But I mean, look at that guy way on the right. He's in a wheelchair. Does that mean he's not as human as we are? What if we put him in a different, what if he's, not just legs broken, but like can't walk and couldn't walk from birth? What if he's in the womb? Does that make him not more human than other people? I would argue no. Because once we start distinguishing or discriminating based on superficial qualities that can't be helped, that opens the door to racism and slavery, because we're dehumanizing someone and using them for their utility or to be disposed of because of our preference or want. And I would argue this applies to the unborn, the elderly, the infirm. When you dehumanize somebody, you deprive them or that group of positive human qualities. And I would argue that dehumanizing is always bad. And it's really fun to make a polarizing statement like that and use the word always or never, because you don't get to do that often. I would argue that dehumanizing is always bad. If they're a human and you dehumanize them, that is always bad. Question for the group: what makes an individual valuable? All right. So what makes an individual valuable? Is it what they contribute to society? Is it their mental, cognitive ability? Well, I would argue that apart from, if Christianity is true, I think you can make a case that what makes an individual valuable is if that individual has a human nature. And I feel that that sentence, that answer is broad enough to cover humans in a sufficient manner well enough to get by. But then you have to start drawing arbitrary lines about what defines a human nature and what human nature is, and then you kind of get into, well, these people, these animals look like humans. Does that mean they're humans? So I can affirm that grounding, that it's one with it. What makes an individual valuable is having a human nature, one with a human nature. But I don't think it gives us the full view, because if Christianity is true, then the biblical view of humanity doesn't just give us a view of why slavery is wrong, but it gives us this framework to treat every person with equal dignity and worth, and not to discriminate on anything: the elderly, the unborn, the mentally or physical ability, sexuality, race, ethnicity, etc. So if Christianity is true, we can affirm the grounding of human nature, but we can go one step further and ground humanity's value in the image of God. So if Christianity is true, antebellum slavery would be wrong. In addition to all those verses I previously mentioned, the image of God in Genesis 1:27, from one man in Acts 17, and all tribes and nations worshiping in the end times. But we can go to 1 Samuel 16:7. The second half of that says, "The Lord sees not as the man sees. The Lord looks on the man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart," meaning that God doesn't see what we all see. God is only caring about what's in your heart. Acts 10:35 says, "In every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." So it seems that the line is not what race you are or what tribe you belong to, but it's anyone who fearing, it's your relationship with him, which is the drawing line of being acceptable. Romans 2:11 says God shows no partiality. Romans 10:12, there's no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing riches on all who call on him. There's a theme here of calling on the Lord. 1 Corinthians 12:13 says, "For in one spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slave or free, we're all made to drink of one spirit." So saying that there's not distinctions between slaves or free or Jews or Greeks, that the distinction is all in if you call on the Lord. Galatians 3:28, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So the distinction isn't anything that we've drawn or we've seen and said, okay, here's a difference. Let's make a distinction between these people or these humans and put them on a different level. For in Christ Jesus, we're all one. 1 Timothy 2:4 says that God desires all to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. And he says in there that God desires all people to be saved. And that is not just one particular group. It is all people. So if Christianity is true, the slavery of the antebellum would be wrong. So, wait a second, Wesley. The Bible promotes slavery. What's your deal saying that antebellum slavery is wrong? The Bible and slavery are good buddies. Well, you person that is asking me that, how dare you? No. This is an interesting question, and one that does have an interesting answer, a lot of fun, to dive into. Because what we get to do is we get to look into the Bible, what the Bible actually has to say, and why it says it, kind of trying to reason as best as we can to what it looks like. Not to just excuse the Bible and say, well, that is an old book, and it said some old things. But if we're going to hold the Bible up to be God's Word, then we need to look into it and see what it says. And I would point you to an article that I found by J. Warner Wallace back in 2014, 4 differences between New Testament servitude and New World slavery. He uses these terms, New Testament servitude, to mean slavery in the Bible, slavery as mentioned in the Bible, versus New World slavery, antebellum slavery. So he distinguishes between biblical, what slavery was back in the Bible and how people viewed slavery in the Bible, versus the slavery of the Americas a couple hundred years ago. So that is on his site, and I recommend you going and reading that and seeing the differences, seeing what he says for there. Number 1, there are 4 motives, and we're going to go through them fairly quickly, but there's a lot of things in here. So number 1, there's a different motive behind slavery. So in antebellum slavery, the primary motive was for the economic gain of the master. It was just for the master to gain more status and grow that way. But in slavery in the Bible, the motive was actually primarily for the economic relief of the servant. So it's more akin to indentured servitude in terms of, that's why when you read your Bible and you run across these terms, sometimes you'll find the word servant, sometimes you'll find the word bond servant, because it wasn't really, in some cases when it says slavery, it's not really what slavery is. It was being hired out to pay off your debt. And so it was economic relief. You were in a situation and you would enter into slavery, enter into this position, because there was no welfare system. But the motive behind it wasn't for economic gain for your master. It was so that you could get out of a bad situation. So that was more the motive behind slavery. The second thing is how people entered into slavery, and I got a little bit into this. There was 4 different types of how people entered into slavery or remained slaves. Voluntary, temporary, indentured Hebrew servants, so voluntary and also temporary. There's voluntary permanent Hebrew servants. You could become a permanent slave if you chose. Involuntary Hebrew and Gentile criminals in restitution, and then permanent pagan servants. So voluntary, temporary, indentured Hebrew servants would be the thing I was talking about, where you would find yourself in a bad situation. You couldn't get out of debt, couldn't pay off your debts, and so you would hire yourself out to pay off that debt. And that was something that you voluntarily did or kind of were forced into if you were in that situation where there was really no other choice, but it was a way to pay off that debt. You could either be destitute and impoverished, or you could hire yourself out for a number of years until you paid off your debt or somebody freed you. We'll get into that, but it was a voluntary thing that you would go into. It wasn't ideal, but it was a way to get out of debt or to pay off something. Voluntary permanent Hebrew servants, that is if you were in that situation but then realized you wanted to stay there, and like the year of Jubilee came up and you were being released and you said, I don't want to leave, I like my life here, I like my servant, I love my master, I want to stay here, I will not leave. And so then there was ways to keep you as a permanent slave, and so then you would stay a slave by virtue of you electing to stay there. Involuntary Hebrew and Gentile criminals in restitution, so this was more akin to a jail system, a system of paying off your debt to society if you broke the law. So if you had stolen something and you couldn't pay the restitution for what you'd stolen, the punishment for you would be servanthood. Basically, it was the same thing as, you have this debt, so go get it paid off. And if you couldn't, then you would go into slavery. And so it was, and actually then you're not removed from society. You're still in society, but you're paying your debt to society by being a slave and just paying it until it's gone. And then the permanent pagan servants, Israelites were allowed to take slaves from nations around them, and primarily through military conquest, and the motive behind that was God's judgment, and you would be enslaved by being judged. So number 3 is how people were treated once they were slaves, and there's a lot to this one. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically it was being a slave didn't mean the same thing it meant in antebellum slavery. It didn't mean that scene from what did you say it was, Will? Django Unchained. Oh man, it wasn't that scene from Django Unchained where your master let you be eaten by dogs. There were very specific rules about how you were to treat your fellow people and also your fellow or your people who were slaves. That rose to the level of basically the same as freemen. So if you were putting yourself in that position, you didn't diminish any of your rights other than you worked for this person without pay, really. And you were willingly putting yourself in a lower spot. But you were treated not poorly. Slaves, let me see. They were allowed to make the decision if they were going to stay there or not. When it was time for them to be released, they could stay. You could be freed if you were not treated properly by your master. There's rules about if you'd be freed if you were struck by your master and your eye got gouged out. You could be freed because of your eye, or your tooth fell out. You could be freed because of your eye. They had these rights that were given to them in this Hebrew law. And by contrast, the Hammurabi Code, which is a Babylonian book of rules, in it permits Hammurabi Code number 282 permits masters to cut off their slave's ear if they're disrespectful. The slave would be brought to him, and the master will cut off his ear. So that wouldn't happen. The slave would be released if that were to happen. So these things were put in place in order to protect the rights of slaves. So it wasn't that you had free reign to treat your slave however you wanted. And the fourth difference between antebellum slavery and slavery in the Bible is how people were freed from slavery, how they freed themselves. So a family member could purchase your freedom just by paying your debt. If they wanted to come redeem you and they saw you were hired out, they could pay your debt and you would be freed. A slave could purchase his own freedom by paying his debt. Hebrew slaves were freed as a part of a national day of debt forgiveness and rest every 7th year. And as I said, if you had an injury, that would often mean that the slave would gain his freedom. So all humans, even slaves, I don't have this slide on there. All humans have rights. Even slaves, they have rights and privileges under the law and before God. Slavery and bond service are preferable to poverty and destitution, especially when one had a good master. Pentateuchal prescriptions allowed men and women to escape from poverty and provide a means of recovery for economic prosperity. And the family was important. Family was actually maintained in this condition of, even in a condition of poverty and bond service. You'd remain properly related to the broader society and being a part of the family. So that is my answer to slavery in the Bible. There's a bunch of differences. I have a few ways to answer a few specific verses if you wanted to ask those questions. But just to remind you, come on our Utah trip. You'll learn how to confidently share your faith. It's March 16th through the 13th. questions? Yes, I have a question. What about that crazy verse in Exodus 21:21? Exodus 21:21 says, if the slave survives a day or two, this is in there, you can go to that if you can find it. If he survives a day or two, he's not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And that's a crazy verse. I read that, and I go, what does that mean? I agonized over this for a couple weeks, actually. It was very frustrating. I was very down. And then I had a realization, and I was talking to Ben. And I said, Ben, if you and I fight out in my house, and I hurt your hip, and I break your bone or something, you could probably sue me, and you'll go to the hospital, and I'll have to pay some money, right? But if we just have a brawl, and I hurt your hip, and like you're out of work for a few days, but nothing really happens, then nothing really happens. I mean, you can sue me, but there'd be some things that went on, and if there weren't any cops or whatever, nobody's going to do anything. It wasn't great, but nothing really happens. Because we just brawled and we had a disagreement that didn't result in like a broken bone or death, right? So I realized that's similar to what's going on here. But if the slave survives a day or two, he's not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Not that, and that phrase is the one that gets us, right? It makes me all bristly. But for the slave is his money. What it means is, since the slave has put himself or is put in that position, and they get in the brawl, he doesn't, and he's out for a day or two, and he's okay. There's no money or anything that happens because he's working for him, and he's out those days. He's working for him, and then a day or two later, or I think like next week, I finally did the right thing and read the context, which you should have done a while ago. So 18 through 19 talks about when two free men quarrel and fight. And so I hadn't read this yet. I'm not sure why. But they talk about when they fight, and if he strikes him and he's okay, the guy who hit him is okay, but he should pay for the loss of his time and have him thoroughly healed. So in that scenario with me and my buddy Ben, howdy Ben, he's online. Me and my buddy Ben brawl, and I knock him out for a couple days, and he's unable to work. I'm supposed to pay for the loss of his time and have him thoroughly healed. So I'm supposed to actually like either give him money or heal him, help him get healed, or pay for him to be healed, right? That's what two free men are supposed to do. Pay for the loss of his time and have him thoroughly healed. But when it's you and your slave brawling, and nothing actually happens, then he's not to be avenged because the slave is his money. In terms of, he can't pay for the loss of his time. He already lost the time that he was going to work, and have him thoroughly healed. That's probably in there. So that works that way. So it's not a wow, how terrible. If he hits him, that's okay. No, you can't. No, that's not okay. But these are the protections that they have. Also, this is if nothing happens to him. If like I said, if his master hits him or somebody else hits him and gouges out his eye or his tooth falls out, he lets him go. Freedom. Remember, compare that to the Code of Hammurabi that said if the slave says you're not my master and is disrespectful, he's brought to his master and the master cuts off his ear. That's the power the master had over the slave. But in the Bible, if the slave has been injured in such a way, he gets freedom. That is the level of dignity that is bestowed. Okay. Good question. Good question. Thanks, guys. Yes?
So, and just to be clear, the parts where if slave's eye gets gouged out by his master and he's the one to go free because of that, that's in like Leviticus somewhere most likely, or is that somewhere else in Jewish law?
That is either in Leviticus or it's here in Exodus, like right in this area, Exodus 21 or 20. So yes, it's probably in Exodus, right here.
Because I don't remember exactly.
Mhm.
So.
Good question. Yes, in the back.
Wesley, when you guys were doing the research on this whole topic of slavery and racism as it goes together, it seems like something is coming up at UNL, like, for example, in psychology, we were agreeing to this idea of the prison system in the U.S.
Mhm.
kind of, some would call it modern-day slavery in some contexts. You
Mhm.
have people who are in prison who are not really evaluated psychologically, who maybe are in there for, some sort of crime. And so, in our class in psychology, we're obviously studying, psychological problems that they may run into. So we didn't get very deep into it because it was an intro class.
Mhm.
But have you come across any of that in terms of American culture now?
As far as
Investigating
the
an issue that could be
prison system,
yeah, with the current prison system, how they take those who are incarcerated and then use them for basically slave labor.
yeah, no, I have not encountered that.
That's just a conversation that's out there
Yeah.
in the social justice context
Mhm.
maybe, and it's also in the racism context too, I think, because of the level of minority victims that are
Sure.
incarcerated. So that's just a thing probably for your phone separate.
Yes, and in this talk, I did find that there were a lot of different veins
Yeah.
that I could go down. So yeah, the prison system in terms of today and their psychological state, and if they use them for basically slave labor, I know that's been hinted at in things that I've come across and in my past that I can think of, but I didn't get into it. No, that would have to be probably a talk about, is the prison system of today humane?
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
a real cool topic for
Yeah.
industry.
No, I hadn't. I was talking about why slavery is wrong,
Yeah.
so I didn't get into a place where slavery could be.
Yeah, it's a big
Yeah.
thing.
Other questions? Any questions online?
What's I got a question?
Yes, sir.
So, probably the one that we wrestle with the most is this idea of the Jews taking slaves from people that they conquered.
Yeah.
So, what would be the justification for that, or how could we understand that morally?
Yeah, so the question is about Jews taking slaves from people they conquered, military conquests, and why that would be justified, or could that be justified, and that is a hard one to answer, and there's a few different ways to think about it, and it's actually on this slide here. Sometimes there's a difference in Scripture between something that's descriptive and something that's prescriptive. So just keep that in mind. It's not an answer to your question because it was prescribed for the Jews at the time, and so why would that be okay? So, but that's something that we have to keep in mind. So, because often when you hear the objection to the Bible, that the Bible promotes slavery, often it's coupled with so we should have slaves now, or I should sell my daughter into slavery, right? I've seen that meme on Facebook. Good stuff. And so then that objection can be answered with descriptive, prescriptive, right?
Maybe explain that.
Oh, sure. Something that's descriptive is the Bible's describing it, not necessarily prescribing it for New Testament Christians like us, or Christians in the people of all times for all places, but it's more describing what happened, like when the Bible described David having an affair with Bathsheba. That is not a prescriptive statement for us. It was describing an event. So, but to your question of Jews taking slaves from other nations by conquering them, that's where this next one comes in, that it's written for. Often the Bible is written for us, but not necessarily to us. And so that was also written to the Israelites and not for us here. Still doesn't answer your question, which I think this last point here, allowance versus approval, does. There is a difference between a law that was an allowance for, actually this isn't your answer either. Man, I'm just not answering all kinds of stuff. There's a difference between a law that was an allowance versus a law that was an actual approval of something. So laws such as divorce, when Jesus said, because of the hardness of your heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So you could make an argument that divorce is good because the Bible talks about ways to divorce a woman. But Jesus in Matthew 19:8 said that was more of an allowance rather than approval of something. There are a few different things in the Bible that is more of an allowance, and I would argue divorce, polygamy, and slavery would be one of them. So in the case of military conquests, I guess I just wanted to say this slide rather than answer your question, Adam. Sorry. So in the case of military conquests, I would argue all of the time. I don't know if I can say all. I'd have to check into it. It was judgment on a nation. And God was sending the Israelites, just like God was sending the Israelites to judge that nation. And part of that judgment was enslaving some of them. Sometimes it was killing all of them. Sometimes it was killing some of them, devoting their goods to destruction, and sometimes it was enslaving others. And that was God's judgment on that nation. And that's not super palatable to non-Christians, and sometimes to Christians as well, because they don't like that idea of judgment. But why would they? They are non-Christians, and they don't want there to be a judgment. But just like God judged the Israelites, I mean, the Israelites weren't immune from God's judgment. They too were sent into exile for not following, for going their own way. So in the case of Israelites being allowed to purchase slaves from surrounding nations or take them from military conquests, it was usually a case of judgment against that nation. And this was also a culturally understood thing that would happen in 1 Samuel. In the story of David and Goliath, Goliath is shouting at everybody and lays down some terms for if he dies or if he kills their champion. What was to happen, Goliath yells this across to them, that if they kill him, then they will be their servants. But if he kills their champion, then they will be their servants and serve them, is what it says. So this is an understood thing in that time and culture, and God is using it for His glory. Yes.
I wonder if a parallel then could be made to our current penal system.
Mm-hmm.
So if in some situations at least, the slavery that they're entering into is a judgment on them because of moral evil that they've done.
Yeah.
So I could see parallels
Mm-hmm.
And to the point Kristen was making, you know, if you become a prisoner, obviously, in our penal system, you're going to lose a lot of your freedoms. You might be forced to work, but it seems as a society, most of us find that to be morally acceptable because it's in response to the evil things that they've done.
Yeah.
So if we could take that parallel maybe to if these people that the Jews had conquered, if it really was because of moral evil that they did, it could be similar in that it's justified to take away some of their freedom
Yeah.
in response to their evil actions.
So that's a really good point, and I hadn't thought about that, but it's like on this slide that says 4 differences between New Testament servitude and New World slavery. Number 2 is how people entered into slavery, and one of those was Hebrew and Gentile criminals in restitution. So, as a criminal, this was something that could be applied to you if you were caught and needed to pay off your debt, or your crime was such that you wouldn't be able to pay that off. The punishment could be this. But that answer that you just said, if you didn't hear it, is taking that and saying God's judgment on this nation is similar to a penal action from the Israelites onto another nation. Since they're not in this nation together under the same government, this would be an action that can be taken in order to punish, in order to have them pay for the crime that they had of idolatry or sacrificing the mole, that kind of stuff. So that would be a way to answer that as well. Thank you. Any other questions I can't answer? Good stuff. Thanks, guys, for coming. Thanks for hanging out and listening to my wonderfully prepared speech. I'm sure it was wonderfully prepared, as you all saw. Be sure to come to our, where is it? Here it is. This one. Talk to me about it. I'll see you there. We have 1 week left. Next week, Adam is talking about sexuality. So please come and talk about sexuality in the Bible. What's the Bible say about sexuality? How do we understand it? Is it okay? See you next week.